Hi there. In this video, I'll be going over the correct answers to the first passage from the 1991 released AP English Language and Composition multiple choice exam that discusses the Brudenells. I will do my best to explain why the correct answers are correct, and in some cases, I'll also underline why certain incorrect answers are incorrect. So let's go ahead and get started. Number one is asking about purpose. This is a purpose question. So the speaker's primary purpose in the passage is to do one of these things. The correct answer here is C, portray an unusual character. So the passage is mostly focused on James Thomas Brudenell, the child of the two people who got married earlier in the passage. And so that seems to be the best answer here. The describing a series of unprecedented events isn't really correct because there's no indication that things that happened in this passage are unprecedented. I'm sure there have been plenty of families where there was one boy born early on and then lots of girls. I'm sure there have been plenty of people who've lived in places, who've lived in similar circumstances and similar situations to Mr. and Mrs. Brudenell, right? Like it's not really unprecedented. Let's see, characterize an idyllic era. Well, there are a few little references to the fact that this was, maybe out in the countryside in Buckinghamshire, and that maybe theoretically their life was idyllic, but really, I don't think the author's purpose here is to explain what this era was like, that it was idyllic. There's not much evidence of that here. So he just say that their life was a rustic idyll, but he's sort of the author moves away from that the extent to which their life is idyllic pretty quickly. An equitable situation, I don't really know if that's accurate. Maybe a little bit. It's possible you could argue that the situation that where the author, James Thomas Brudenell, got a lot more attention and more sort of was seen in a higher light and a better light than maybe his sisters, could be inequitable, but that's not the overall purpose of the passage. Excuse me. So, and then comment on a popular assumption. I don't really know what the author could be referring to there. A popular assumption like that a person who has all these positive characteristics mentioned later in the passage would also be smart. Maybe, but I think C is still the best answer. Okay, the speaker's perspective in the passage is that of who? Well, the best example here is a chronicler of past events. So, right, is it an acquaintance of James Brudenell? Well, probably not. I think I'm not sure how an acquaintance of James Brudenell would quite know all of these things, and there's just not a lot of evidence to indicate that it is a friend based on his tone in the passage. An uninvolved eyewitness. Well, an eyewitness would see things that happen, but again, may not know all of these details. There are a lot of really intimate details about their lives, about the marriage. Actually, I might also throw in there for why A and C are wrong. There's a lot of reference to primary sources, like the letter from the rector and things that would indicate that it's not an eyewitness or a friend, but rather someone who's engaging in more historical reporting here. So maybe a commentator on social trends. Well, a trend is something that sort of changes, right? Something that sort of maybe isn't there and then appears, and then maybe fades away. I'm not really seeing that the word trend is represented by this passage. And then defender of an unpopular figure. We don't really have evidence that James Brudenell was unpopular. I think he was actually quite popular. He was just also had some other characteristics. And so, also, I'm not sure that the author here is biased in favor or against James Brudenell. I think he's just sort of reporting this is who he was, this is what happened, and here are all these different primary and secondary sources to support what happened. Alrighty, moving on. Number 3. In the first sentence of the passage, the speaker's attitude toward the material is that is a person who is doing one of these things, or who is described maybe by one of these statements. Correct answer here is C, so familiar with the realm described as to be somewhat cynical. All right, he does say up here, it was not a union which seemed likely to prosper, since its chief characteristics were imprudence, youth, and extreme good looks. But the married life of the young Brudenells unexpectedly turned out to be a rustic isle. So here's why the word cynical makes this answer correct, right? This one word is it. He's sort of like, hey, these people got married because they were both imprudent, like maybe didn't make the smartest, wisest decisions. They were young when they got married, and they were both very attractive. Okay, and therefore, usually in cases where these are the characteristics that lead to a marriage, or usually when these characteristics lead to a marriage, the marriage doesn't last or doesn't necessarily result in much prosperity, which in this case you might argue is the birth of lots of children who are, and at least one of whom is seen as an upstanding person or a respectable person. So, all right, we're gonna move right along. So the word democratic in lines 9 to 10 is best understood to mean one of these things. Synonym? Okay, this is definitely a vocabulary question. Let's look at 9 to 10. We got to look at a word in context. This is a really important reading strategy. Not just what does the word mean, but what does it mean in context? Lines 9 to 10. Let's look at lines 9 to 10. Here they are. The rector of Hambledon at the time has left letters in which are glimpses of an amiable, charitable, and democratic pair. They preferred not to use their title, and even after Robert had succeeded his uncle as Earl of Cardigan, they were known in Hambledon as Mr. and Mrs. Brudenell. Okay, so an earl is nobility, right? Indicates nobility, but Mr. and Mrs. are titles that are used by people who, as opposed to like Lord and Lady or whatever the equivalence might be for that particular title of nobility. I'm not quite sure what it would be for an earl. But the idea here is that they were known as Mr. and Mrs. And they were charitable, and they bought some land and then they gave it to the village, right? They did all these things that maybe someone who is a less maybe more full of themselves and their title and their social position might not. And so E, unpretentious, is totally the right answer here. Okay, the citations from the rector of Hambledon's letters do all of the the citations from the rector of Hambledon's letters do all of the following except one of these things. Our correct answer here is definitely going to be B, illustrate the rector's influence over the Brudenells. We don't really know that the rector had influence over them at all. I think this is a case where jumping to conclusions might cause you to choose the wrong answer. Yes, in some cases, religious folks or people who have religious power, religious positions can influence the behavior of the people in their geographic area or the area for which they are geographically responsible. But in this case, it doesn't. The evidence doesn't actually support that. So B is the correct answer. All of these other things, right, documenting the speaker's sketch of the Brudenells, right, serving as evidence of what the speaker is saying, characterizing the simplicity of life in Hambledon. There's cottagers who have gardens, definitely. Provide evidence of the Brudenells' philanthropy. They bought 2.5 acres of land, which is not a small amount. That would have been probably several British pounds sterling. And so, right, that's there. And then present tense commentary, you have to know present tense. You have to know this grammar term to get this answer correct. Robert, ever good friend to Hambledon, bought 2.5 acres of land. That's past tense, but then these gardens are present tense, a great benefit and much prized. So E is something that the record of Hambledon's letters do all of the do. Again, the one thing not represented here is B. 6. Which of the following best describes the words wealth, rank, power, and honors as they're used in lines 28 to 29? I think this was a pretty wily one, honestly. I thought this was pretty, this was challenging. You have to make sure you really get what's going on in the context, right? So circumstances surrounding his arrival were impressive. It was 3 generations since the succession of the Earls of Cardigan had gone direct from father to son. The much desired heir was of almost mystic importance. And as he lay in his cradle, wealth, rank, power, and honors gathered round his head. Okay. So if you think literally in this context about like people gathering around him, this could that could lead you astray, right? That maybe could be that could lead you to choose A, members of James Brudenells' family, or maybe even could lead you to choose D. Now, we don't really know anything about burdens placed on the child later in his life. Yes, some nobility in some cases would have to suffer burdens later in their lives that they maybe didn't want, but just because they were born into nobility, they had to deal with them. Okay, but that's not the case here. And then ambiguous references to previous Earls of Cardigan, no. Okay, so now we're really left with the C, personifications of the inordinate blessings of the child, and E, exaggerations of James Brudenell's later accomplishments. But do we really get a lot of evidence that James Brudenell accomplished a lot of things? I mean, maybe he was good at a lot of things later in the passage, but I'm not sure that quite qualifies as accomplishments. Also, wealth, rank, power, and honors are things that were given to him by his social status and not necessarily things that he earned by accomplishing things. So I think C, therefore, is going to be the best answer here. The personifications of the inordinate blessings of the child. And later on, I think when you learn a little more about the situation in which you grew up, that reinforces C as the correct answer. I was talking in this paragraph like 30 all the way through line 30 all the way through line 52. Alrighty, so number 7. As such, lines 36, 37, the phrase "as such boys do" function primarily as one of these things. Correct answer, E, an emphasis on the inevitability of a particular environment producing a particular effect. So we really have to look first at this at the sentence in which this line appears, right? That's going to be 36, 37. That's here. He was brought up at home among his sisters, and he grew up as such boys do, spoilt, domineering, and headstrong. No arm was stronger than his, no rude voice contradicted him, no rough shoulder pushed him. All right. So this was the situation, right? This was the situation, right? And then just after this, right, later on, we get some commentary on how he ended up as a person, right? From his earliest consciousness, he was the most important, the most interesting, most influential person in the world. He retained from these early years a liking for the society of women, and so he sort of was a little bit arrogant maybe when dealing with men, but his behavior toward women struck his other people who lived in that time with surprise, and he behaved with medieval deference, maybe and chivalry toward women. Maybe even to an extent that was embarrassing and productive of astonishment and mirth, right? All of these things. Right? So you get this like sort of this buried implicit cause-effect relationship between his environment and the way he was then perceived by other people. That one definitely makes E the correct answer here. All right. The speaker uses the images of no arm, no rude voice, and no rough shoulder to emphasize that James Brudenell lacked B, the competition of male siblings, right? He was brought up in a room full of sisters, and he didn't have sort of tempering forces that would be male siblings to sort of calm down his arrogance a little bit. And so this question is almost an extension of the previous one, continuing to ask about the environment in which James Brudenell grew up. Alrighty, 9. Which of the following phrases could best be substituted for the phrase he was in line 40 to make the meaning more explicit? This is a writing question. So let's go and look there. Line 40, where is it? It's down here. From his earliest consciousness, he was the most important, the most interesting, the most influential person in the world. He proved himself to be the most important, the most interesting, the most important in the world. I don't know if he did that. He might have become the most important, the most interesting, the most influential person in the world. Well, this is really his conception of himself, right? I think so. I'm not sure that B works, and I think that actually that conception of himself and the way he was, since it's in his own consciousness, I think this actually supports A and B being the wrong answer. He aspired to be, well, he was sort of already in this high social position. I'm not sure C works. He was treated as, let's try that. From his earliest consciousness, he was treated as the most important, the most interesting, the most influential person in the world. He retained, however, from his early years a liking for the society of women. Okay, interesting. I think D works. D is the best answer here, and the College Board agrees. D is the right answer. He was fated to be all of these things. Well, we don't really know what he ends up doing, right? We don't know the other end of the fate arc, a la Romeo and Juliet. We don't know if he ends up in a tomb with some girl later on. I don't know. We don't know that. We're not given that information, so E can't be right. Okay. 10. In context, the phrase "having regard to his manner with men," lines 44 to 45, indicates that James Brudenell one of these things. Well, the one of these things that's correct is definitely D, was often rude and arrogant, right? There's a bit of information left out right here, right? We learn we hear that he didn't have any male siblings and that he was spoiled, domineering, and headstrong. No rude voice to contradict him, no arm stronger than his, no rough shoulder pushed him. He was the most important, most interesting, most influential person in the world. And then we learn about how he interacts with women. But there's this piece missing. We don't really know how he interacts with men. All we get is this little, like, having regard to his manner with men that the author doesn't bother mentioning to indicate that must be some way he interacted with men. We have to fill in the blank and make an inference. And D, was often rude and arrogant, is the best inference from among these choices. Okay. 11. The phrase "productive of astonishment and mirth," lines 50 to 51, is best described as B, a circumlocution for appearing ridiculous. All right, the way he behaved was sometimes embarrassing. He went about interacting with women with medieval deference. He had a readiness to protect and defend. Right, all of these things are seen as sort of funny. Mirth is laughter, sort of uncomfortable laughter. It's sort of a cousin of the laughter that comes out when you watch a really awkward scene in The Office or something, right? Or Eastbound and Down or something. You feel really weird, but it's also funny and astonishing. That's mirth. So definitely B here. Okay. In lines 53 to 69, the speaker creates the impression that James Brudenell was 53 to 69. We better look. 53 starts here. We're looking at this whole section, 53 to all the way to here. All of these things, all of these crazy things that he did, he was conventionally attractive according to maybe 19th century norms. He was good at a lot of like physical things, and he was good at, or he had a sort of way of interacting with other people that was seen as gallant and dashing. All right, so our answer here is going to be A, an extraordinary figure with minor imperfections. Like, maybe he had a fault. It was that the lower part of his face was oddly long and narrow, so that sometimes one was surprised to catch an obstinate, almost a foxy look. But then immediately he switches to back to positive things. He does call his horsemanship reckless, which is maybe sort of and maybe sort of has a negative connotation. Maybe he Right. Maybe some of these things are not necessarily that smart for him to be doing. So he has some minor imperfections, but he's otherwise an extraordinary figure. A. Okay. 13. Which of the following contributes to the effect of the last three sentences of the passage at line 69 to 73? Ooh, one of these crazy questions. All right. So the appending of stupidity to a list of positive attributes. That seems like it would add, right? The ending here is sort of a surprise, like, oops. Again, very important that you read the whole thing and that you focus as much attention to the end of the passage as you did to the rest of the passage, because if you miss this or you try to save some time by skipping the last 5 lines, that would not go well for you. Right. The effect of the last 3 lines is definitely one of shock, one of like, wait, he's unusually stupid, he's an ass, like, wait a second, are we saying nice things about this guy? So it's surprising, it's shocking, there's a little bit of shock value here. So we're appending stupidity to a list of positive attributes. The speaker's earlier description of James Brudenell, well, his earlier description was sort of like how he grew up. He was domineering, headstrong, arrogant. So I think stupidity contrasts with that in an indirect way. And then admiring tone, lines 63 to 69. Yes, that contrasts as well with stupidity. So E, 1, 2, and 3 is the correct answer. Interjection, alas, line 71 emphasizes the speaker's one of these things. He says, he was, alas, unusually stupid. Right. So again, this is piggybacking off of this idea of the shock value that the ending provides. And it so happens that the AP exam, in fact, used the word shock here. So B, shock on encountering the unexpected, is not going to be our correct answer, because there's actually a central irony that's being mentioned here toward the end. This central irony is that despite all of these crazy positive things, that characterize James Brudenell, he was also unusually stupid. All right, 15. The reference to Greville's pronouncement, lines 71 to 72, serves primarily to do one of these things. Greville's pronouncement, that is again referring to this thing, an ass. I'm not really sure this arouses sympathy for James Brudenell. He's an Earl of Cardigan and has a lot of things going for him. The speaker's naivety, I don't know about that. I think the speaker has a pretty good idea of what's really going on, and he's a historian with a lot of evidence to back up his perspectives. So A goes off the balcony. C, provide an opinion contrary to that of the speaker. No, I think the speaker agrees. This is actually really just information that supports what's being said. Introduce the primary source of the speaker's information. I mean, I think the primary source of the speaker's information was probably something else. Greville sort of later on made a commentary on this that the historian who's writing this passage happened to run across. And so E, reinforce what the speaker has said about James Brudenell's intellect in the previous line is really what was really the best answer here. 16, in the concluding sentence of the passage, the speaker's attitude toward James Brudenell is chiefly one of, let's see, is it embarrassed apology? Well, I'm not really sure there's an apology going on here. Who was apologizing for whom? I don't think anyone needs apologizing for. Inquisitive perplexity. Inquisitive implies a question, like the author doesn't really quite understand what's going on or quite understand what happened. Here, the melancholy truth was that his glorious golden head had nothing in it. That's a pretty definitive statement. I'm not sure there's much. I'm not sure he's perplexed or questioning. Strong resentment. He's just reporting reality. I don't think anyone resents anything here. Surprised confusion. Well, again, like, is he questioning? Is he perplexed? Is he not sure what's going on? No, he's a historian. He has evidence to support his claims. He knows what's happening. The only one that really works here is wry detachment, and wry is funny, right? Wry is sort of like, it's like restrained humor. So definitely going to be the correct answer, a wry detachment. The author is a historian. He doesn't really have that much of an attachment to what is being said here. Doesn't really, like, what he says about James Brudenell is probably not going to impact him personally that much. He's just reporting the facts in an interesting way. All right, 17, the last question. In the last paragraph, a primary rhetorical strategy of the speaker is to do one of these things. The correct answer is C, arouse expectations about a character which are proved to be false, right? So, and you could argue that the author is like, hey, James Brudenell grew up in these pretty interesting circumstances, right? With a bunch of sisters. He was sort of arrogant. He was given a lot of privilege from a young age. His behavior was seen as ridiculous at some points, but it was still, people were generally still understanding that it came out of genuine sympathy. He had all these talents. He was really, really attractive. And so, like, the next thing that would make sense for him to say is like, oh yeah, by the way, he was also totally a Renaissance man. He was a genius. He studied all these cool things. Nope, he was an ass. C is correct. End of file.